Hello, my name is Mari, and I am here with these two lovely ladies, Farouz and Lilly, and we are basically going to be discussing things about BLM, protesting, riots and looting, and many more. So you guys can go ahead and introduce yourselves.
You can go ahead.
My name is Farouz, and I grew up in the United States. My family is Eritrean, but I've been born and raised in America, and I went to school in Seattle, Washington, and recently moved to the DC area, and I currently work as a program coordinator for American University in their Center for Community Engagement and Service.
Okay.
My name is Lilly Chauhan. I am an Ethiopian American, and I was born and raised here in Silver Spring. I am a freshman or upcoming sophomore at the University of Maryland studying public policy. I'm also an executive board member of the Youth Activism Project based in DC for youth and social justice advocacy.
Okay. Okay. So you guys know what we're about to talk about, the whole Black Lives Matter situation, the looting, the riots, and all of that. But I know there's a lot of, or at least you could say, like the Abasha community tends to think that we're not really a part of the situation, or we're not a part of that circle, but yet we are in a way. And I understand that we were raised different culturally, but yet we are still the same as we were raised here in the United States. So what do you think of that statement, Farouz, like of us not being a part of that circle, or just not us being a part of that situation with other Blacks?
I think it's fair for some Eritreans and Ethiopians who have recently moved to the country and maybe have not yet identified with American culture and American politics to not totally understand what it means to be racially Black. I think, you know, us here, we've been raised with Black Americans, we've been raised with white Americans and other Americans from different countries and nationalities, and we can understand how sometimes we get grouped in based on how we look and not necessarily the culture that we raised and the country that we identify with. Yeah. So at home, of course, I identified as Eritrean. That's how my parents raised me in that culture. But when I was in school, right, people didn't know me as an Eritrean woman, right? They knew me as Black, right? So then that ended up affecting the way that maybe some opportunities came to me or did not, maybe the way some people treated me or not, and especially, you know, my brother and other, you know, Eritrean males that I knew. So understanding that makes me feel like I have a responsibility, right, as someone who may look Black to some people, and really being like an ally to Black Americans who are from here. We're not ethnically the same, right? And we don't look exactly the same either, but we do get grouped in. And so to protect each other, I think it's something that we should want to do.
For sure, absolutely. What do you think?
I think it is fair to say for people who recently emigrated here that it'll take a while to get used to the Black community here. But at the same time, no one is necessarily asking Ethiopian Americans or Eritrean Americans to assimilate to Black culture here. Yeah. It's more about, like, when we're talking about fighting the powers that be and systemic discrimination and racism, they will see us as alike. They only see you as the skin color that you are and your physical appearance. And I think it's also a really important discussion to talk about how a lot of Abashas see us with some type of superiority complex as opposed to other Black Americans for whatever reason it may be. And a lot of the times it's really superficial because it comes down to physical features and things like that, which is, you know, a whole other discussion of colorism and stuff like that. So I don't really think it's necessarily an ethical basis that people differentiate themselves from Black Americans from, but they need to grow up and get over it, especially if they're going to live in this country.
For sure, absolutely. I definitely think that we need to fight together, regardless of what culture we were raised in or what our ethnicity is, because if I get pulled over, I am still Black, and therefore I am scared for my life. But so with the Black Lives Matter movement, do you guys see the necessity of it? And if you do, why do you see it? Like, why do you see the movement so necessary for people to join? And would it make an impact to what's going on in this country?
Yeah, so I think political activism comes in many different forms. Everything from, you know, helping other people who may look like you and do not have opportunities and maybe giving them those opportunities, right, if you can afford them. and some maybe going out into the streets and marching, right? So I don't think activism has to look one way, but I think Black Lives Matter came out of a need to highlight, you know, how Black people in this country aren't seen as the same, aren't given equal treatment, right? And essentially do not matter, right? That's kind of the messaging that Black people have received for so long. So how do we correct that, right? The slogan that really emphasizes Black lives do in fact matter, right? So I think there are organizations that have come from that, right? There's an actual group called Black Lives Matter, and some people may align with them. And it gets tricky with maybe organizations just because there's so many different, you know, agendas and things that people want to get done. But I think as, you know, a Black air trained person, I can say that I do support, you know, anyone who wants, you know, equity and equality and wants, you know, togetherness and peace, right? So I think as an individual, it's important to do good for others, right? And, you know, the least of those in America right now is Black Americans. So however I can help, I think it's in my best interest to do so.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I just think like over the years, as Black Lives Matter became an actual organization, and then like basis from like 2014, and it became more decentralized, and there's a bunch of chapters all over the United States. Like it did become more of a political issue, which it should be, because we should be fighting for civic change, like at a higher level. However, like at the very basis of it, it's like it's a human rights issue. Like it's a basic human rights issue. It's about basic liberties and privileges that we are supposed to be granted, but we aren't. But it's not necessarily government sanctioned, so they say we can't do anything about it. But Black Lives Matter to me is just about Black liberation in every single way. And so I think it's important just to emphasize that Black Lives Matter and tell people like why it's different than a different group mattering. And even if it is a marginalized group, not necessarily all lives matter, because the Black struggle is completely different than any other struggle in the history of America, and furthermore globally, it's completely different, the subjugation of Black people. And so until every single group can realize that it's not an issue of just us, but you know, you can't just like see us and understand us, but you have to feel it with us in order to fight for our freedoms, because it's no longer all a civic issue. It's more like how we're treated on an interpersonal and then institutional level because of that.
Yeah, and I think something that people, I don't think realize sometimes is, you know, when, you know, Black Americans in this country are at the same level as everyone else, and, you know, oppression won't exist anymore, right? When the bottom is lifted up, then there's no longer a bottom, right? And I think that's everyone's goal, where we're all seen as equals. There isn't this hierarchy or this kind of like totem pole or whatever. So yeah, I definitely agree with whatever you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I really definitely think this is such a significant matter for us to bring up, regardless of what our ethnicity is. And I'm really glad that you guys are joining me for this, because this is a very powerful but yet sensitive discussion. But we will be back more with different subjects as to protesting, riots and looting, and many more. All right, so I am back here with Farouz and Lilly, and we are going to be discussing over things like protesting and defunding the police, which I went to a protest here at right by the White House, actually, and I can say that it was really powerful, and I didn't think that a lot of people were actually going to come out. I remember you telling me that you actually went to a protest. Can you talk a little bit about that and how the experience was?
Yeah, so I went to 3 protests actually. One of them was in downtown DC, which is by 16th Street, the White House, by all the monuments and the museums and stuff. Yeah, that one was like the first one I went to, so I didn't really know what to expect, even though I've been to marches before. But this one was a little bit different because it was like in the heat of the moment, like first 2 weeks after everything with George Floyd happened. It was a really, really rewarding experience to see so many different kinds of people coming together and like shouting things like defund and abolish, which is like words we don't really hear, especially like when near the White House and stuff like that. Yeah, that was just a general Black Lives Matter protest. After that, I went to a student-led one, actually here in downtown Silver Spring. It was really nice because it was all student speakers and really young people, and it was really empowering to hear so many people deciding to educate themselves and just speaking out about things that have usually been taboo, like in the past, especially like in such a tight-knit area where people are just like walking through. And the other one I went to was probably my favorite one. It was a couple weeks ago. It was specifically a Protect Black Women March, and it was in DC, but I really liked that one because it wasn't in the typical areas where most of the marches are. It was like within like the gentrified neighborhoods of DC, like the neighborhoods that are super quiet and where the apartments are and things like that. So they didn't actually close the roads for us. We closed them ourselves by like walking through, and it was like everyone was looking out their windows, and it was kind of like a spectacle, which was the intent. And yeah, we walked up hills really far, and then we had a rally in Malcolm X Park, and a lot of like bystanders were watching, and I feel like since the speakers were really powerful, we informed a lot of people. So that one was my favorite one, especially since we don't really talk about Black women in particular, like separating them from the Black community and talking about their individual struggles. So I really like that one.
Okay. So, Feroz, with these protests, a lot of people tend to think that there's no use of it. Like, what's the point of protesting? What is, like, how are people or citizens going to make an impact to getting or fighting for justice?
Yeah, so I think it's part of our amendment rights, right? It's our freedom of speech. I think it's well within our rights to exercise our freedom of speech and ask our government to be held to the standard that they said that they would be, right? That they would follow that this law that they have set, like this is the law that they had signed and agreed to follow, and they are not, right? So it's who else is to keep them in check if not the citizens of the country, right? So I think it's part of our civic duty to protest. I mean, it's all over the world you see protests, right? Whether it's Europe, Africa, all over the world, I think people exercise this freedom to go into the streets and say, hey, yes, we do respect our government. Yes, we do believe in democracy, but when things aren't right, it's our job to say it isn't right, and you must listen to us, right? So I think protesting is beautiful, especially when there's, like you said, like the speakers and there's that unity, and you really see what togetherness looks like in practice, right? And I've done a lot of protesting in college, and now recently with what's been going on. And I wouldn't say that every single person, it's a mandate that you must, but I think it is in your best interest as a citizen to exercise your freedom, because there's a lot of places where you can't, right? And I think it's a really great way to show that you are for your nation and for your people.
Absolutely, for sure. Lately on Twitter, I've been seeing people put a hashtag defunding the police, and I guess society thinks that when we say defund the police, we're trying to get rid of them, and like we don't want cops type of thing. But that's not the case, right? When we say defunding the police, we are saying that we want to take some of their budget and put it on often neglected things, like into public health or education, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that it's relevant to defund the police?
Yes, I think it's not just an end goal, it's a milestone, like it's an initial mark, and in my opinion, to disbanding the police eventually at some point. But defunding the police means even just taking half of their budget, which is over $50 billion nationally, and reinvesting it into the communities that are often neglected and that are also often victims of police violence most. Like when you look at places like DC, Northeast DC, Southwest DC, and like Camden, New Jersey, Harlem, things like that, like the most police presence and also the most amount of money allocated to them. But those areas are riddled with crime, high drug rates, gangs, incarceration rates, and things like that. So it's like, what is the money actually going towards? If we took away, like the money mainly honestly goes towards, if you look at city budgets, goes towards like cars, new weapons, new buildings, and they kind of slap on reform on top. So it looks like they're making some type of effort to reform police behavior, but reforms have been implemented in the past and they haven't proven to remove prejudice because they can't remove prejudice at its core, which is the result of police violence. Police violence has never been because police are abiding by rules or protocol that they're supposed to follow. It's the absence of that. And then afterwards they are not prosecuted to the fullest extent because of that, because they are given that shield, that God complex of being a police officer, being protected by the city and by the state. So I feel like it is a very plausible thing to want to disband the police because they work for the state and they're the state's stronghold, and the state is riddled with racism and prejudice through policies and things like that. So defunding the police is just a first step, and it's not radical at all if you think about it. Literally just starting with taking half the budget nationally and reinvesting it into social work, things like that, like restorative justice work and things like that. People who dedicate their lives and who are educated and things like this, who could deal with things that police are usually called for anyway, and the way they deal with it is never actually helpful because they're not using their minimal amount of training isn't usually in that. It's about how to de-escalate situations or in violent situations because they don't have a lot of training, but the little that they do is never statistically significant in helping these types of situations that they're usually called for. So we should be funding things and institutions and people who are educated and make it their life's work to help people in situations like that.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. What do you think about the whole defunding the police situation?
So I agree with the fact that I think there needs to be a little better allocation of money. The police does get a huge amount of money in terms of taxpayers' money, right? So a lot of the times it's a third of our tax budget is going straight to the police force, right? So I'm not sure if that's necessarily correct, right? But I think that a country without a police force is a little frightening because if I can't trust the police, how am I supposed to trust just any, neighborhood watchman, right? Because there was George Zimmerman, and that didn't work out either for us. So I think we need to uphold the institution higher standard, right? I think we need to have more transparency in this institution and also radically change the way that these trainings are held and the hiring process, right? The type of people that they're hiring are usually people who want power and who maybe are not as equipped to be in other fields, right? And these are all my opinions. I'm not saying these as facts, but I think defunding the police to a certain extent could definitely be the benefit of the people, right? As you said, like a lot of programs in our communities would be a lot more helpful for disenfranchised people, right? Maybe bringing them into more socially driven programs and things like that might be more helpful in terms of bringing people together so that there's less crime, making people feel invested in their community so that they have more things to do, other things to think about rather than, whatever else there is. But in terms of the abolishing, which I think is what people hear, right, when they hear defund the police, I don't think those things are not the same. And I think it's a smaller minority who want the abolishment totally, right? Yeah. And not to say that that's, those people can't have those opinions, but for me personally, I think this institution needs to be changed, transformed, renewed, the blood of Jesus maybe, but yeah, so I think me and my personal beliefs, I think that there is hope and there is an opportunity for change here. And I think that we can do that and make that change. Absolutely,
there is hope. We'll be back more, and we'll be talking about things about riots and looting and just conclusions. So I'm back with Farouz and Lilly, and we're going to be discussing more about riots versus looting and the differences between them. From my point of view, I think that people tend to get confused with the definitions to even begin with. Looting is more of using the pandemic to steal and take away from stores or whatever. And then with riots, it's more of a language of us trying to get America's attention and, fighting for justice. It's just anger, like they're showing how angry they are. So what do you think of those two words just clashing together?
They are definitely two distinct things, but people have, like you said, kind of melded them together, especially since they were both happening in like the first week or two after George Floyd died and all the protests broke out. Rioting definitely, I feel like, has been the language of the oppressed for a very long time in the United States. A lot of the times people only respond to violence, or at least the media, which favors, white people and white supremacy, they focus more on our issues when it's spoken in riots and violence and yelling at the people in power, or being on the front lines and being face to face with the cop, or going to a politician's house, or going up to public buildings and things like that, or perhaps like tearing things down. And yes, it is destructive. Yes, sometimes it can be radical, but sometimes it's the only way that you can actually get your message across and be heard, especially if you are in a community where you were, let's say, born, raised, you work, you serve, but at the end of the day, you can still be killed in that same community just because of the color of your skin. So nothing really in that community serves to protect you in the first place. So why not respond to violence with violence? You have no social capital there. Nothing protects you, nothing was built for you. You are working against the powers that be in order to succeed, no matter if you grew up somewhere or not. So when you see people that look like you being killed in cold blood by the state, it makes you angry. And so your first response is obviously like, why not respond to violence with violence? Why do I have to uphold the God complex of the police and be respectful to them when they don't care about my issues, especially when military police were deployed in DC, and it was like no longer a bad apples thing, it was all of them, and they were being completely horrible to protesters, like taking away their food and their water and beating them, even peaceful protesters. So like, how do you really delineate the difference between peaceful and non-peaceful? And how is there only a few bad apples when it seems like it's us against them and we're fighting for our voices to be heard? We can't always do that peacefully. But looting is a little bit different than rioting because, as you said, sometimes people take advantage of the fact that we're in a pandemic and, the defenses are down. So a lot of people just take it as an opportunity to steal stuff, but I don't understand why the media, again, media that favors white supremacy, is focusing so much on individuals taking random products from mostly multi-billion-dollar companies. No one is looting any small businesses or black-owned businesses or any small bodegas or anything like that. It's like large corporations, and it will not make even the tiniest dent in their income or anything like that, but it's just the principle that yes, it's illegal, but why are we caring so much about products when we're fighting for human lives and we're not looking at the alternative as to everything else that's at stake? And I think even though it can be destructive and it is understandable as to why you wouldn't necessarily think it's the best thing to do, whereas protesting really isn't, I think that it has done its job in terms of media attention and outrage and things like that, so yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Lately, people just been saying that riots have been not a good look on Black people. Like, it's just only making the situation worse. What do you think of that statement? And if someone were to say that to you, what would you say to them?
I mean, it's diminishing a lot of really good work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like you were saying, it's not fair to, judge the majority or, give the majority this, terrible outlook or kind of label them as rioters or looters, right? When there's a lot of people who are working for policy, who are protesting peacefully, who are doing all these incredible things to push this agenda forward, right, for peace and equity. And it's really unfortunate when that small minority gets to kind of take claim to this movement, right? And that they are branded as the, like the face of this movement, right? So I would just say that it's unfair, and if you want to be a part of change, I think you need to look at the whole picture and really look into how you can either take part in the good or highlight the good so that that's what's getting circulated, because like you said, sometimes the media can be a little skewed in what they choose to show and highlight, right? Because, misery and terrible things, terrible news sells. So sometimes that's what we see perpetuated on the news rather than the amazing feats of, Black, white, tons of people who are doing amazing things for the community and actually uplifting each other.
Absolutely. I remember having a discussion with a friend of mine, and it was about these whole situations of just Black Lives Matter and just, the whole situation. And they were basically saying that he basically lost hope. What's the point of BLM? Why protest? It's not going anywhere. So I guess my question is to inspire the youth and tell them that there is hope and that there are reasons, good reasons, and it would make a huge impact if we do protest. call out people on social media. What would you tell them to inspire them that there is still hope for doing all these things?
So as someone who's worked with the youth a lot in the past and youth advocates and activists, I feel like a good amount of them know that if they are into civic engagement, that they will be the ones making change in the future, because decades and decades and hundreds of years of interventions with our government and revolutions and things like that have served to make change, but that change was instilled even in in a government that still promoted systemic discrimination and racism and things like that. Right. So it's like right now we are using language that imagines an entirely different world, where once our generation is the one who yields the power, we'll be able to implement policy and policy change and reform, and we're going to be the ones in those seats, as we're already seeing now in the House and things like that. I feel like we are much more resilient, the youth, in not losing hope and things like that. But yeah, I feel like the youth is here to stay and they will make change.
The youth is definitely here to stay. What do you think about the situation?
I mean, like Lilly was saying, we can look at history, right? Change doesn't happen overnight. It's incremental. And we wouldn't be in this country right now if Black Americans didn't, get involved in the long race and really endure through those protests, those riots, and all those different acts of change. So I think we can learn from history. And I think, again, as you said, the youth are feeling empowered. And also in this age of technology, right, the youth are way more educated than ever, right, historically. So I think we should feel definitely grateful for where we are at and the resources that we have as especially Americans. So I think that gives me a lot of hope, knowing that these are the people who have the future in their hands.
Right. Ladies, thank you guys so much for joining me and discussing over the important things of Black Lives Matter movement, protesting, looting, riots, all of that. And I feel like it's important to kind of put it out there for the Abasha community to and help them understand what we're going through as Black people in the United States of America. So thank you all for tuning in. I really hope you learned something and got a little bit of something out of this discussion, and I hope you stay safe.